Prince George's County. We have our town hall tonight on social justice, brought to you by one of our grants via IKEA. We thank you, and tonight you're going to be blessed with Mentee of the Year from last year, Javen Wood, who is going to be a rising freshman at Howard University. Javen Wood?
Much obliged, President Rainier, for your kind words. Greetings. My name is Javen Wood. For the past 3 years, I've been a proud, grateful, and prosperous mentee with the 100 Black Men of Prince George's County Incorporated, which we often refer to as the 100 Village. My mentors bestowed me many attributes, such as mastering the stock exchange, scoring eagles while off, even how to tie my own tie, amongst few. I am also a graduating senior from Sabara Park High School, and I will be enrolling in the Howard University this fall as a freshman. As a Bison, I will major in marketing and minor in English. I truly hope you all enjoy our enlightening dialogue. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mentor Glam.
Good evening, and welcome to the 100 Black Men of Prince George's County's Town Hall on social justice and voter rights. It is indeed our privilege and our honor to have you join us this evening as we tackle this daunting topic. We have this evening joining us a very august panel of professionals and civil rights icons. And we appreciate the fact that we get to kick off our town hall with the illustrious words of the great and senior member of the United States Congress, Congressman James Clyburn.
Going on today has history, and we ought to be or allow me to participate in this very, very important session. It's important for us to keep in mind that whatever's going on today has history, and we ought to be instructed by history. I often quote George Santayana, who once wrote that if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we are bound to repeat them. And I caution you, there's one thing to learn the incidents of history. There's something totally different to learn those lessons. When John Lewis and I first met as 19-year-old college students back in October 1960, we were challenging the system, trying to get off the back of the bus, trying to get the right to vote. In fact, John Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in March of 1965, and when he did, only 2% of African Americans in Alabama were registered to vote. He took a horrible beating on that day, but 6 months later, August 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that was the consequence of what we now call Bloody Sunday. But you know what? John Lewis, in spite of that tremendous victory, in spite of his dedication, in less than a year later, John Lewis had been kicked out of SNCC. SNCC was taken over by a group who developed a motto of burn, baby, burn. And it destroyed that movement. John Lewis even left Georgia, was gone for more than a year. But he went back, regathered, And now we lionize him, and he's deserving of every bit of it. So I say to each and every one of you, let's not allow sloganeering to destroy the movement. Black Lives Matter is a great movement. Selma in March of '65 was a moment. But Lyndon Baines Johnson, with the signing of the Voting Rights Act of '65, turned it into a movement. Black Lives Matter is a good movement. Let's join it. Let's not allow outsiders or anybody else to destroy it with sloganeering. Let's learn the lessons of history. And if we do, maybe we will not repeat them. Thank you and good luck.
Congressman, thank you so much for your words of encouragement, understanding, and forward thinking and movement. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, please allow me to introduce our esteemed panel who will be tackling
Let me
these
begin by
topics
thanking you for
this
allowing me
evening.
to participate.
Starting with my friend and counselor, A. Scott Bolden. Scott Bolden is the current managing partner in the Washington office of the law firm of Reed Smith. He is a prominent trial attorney who has lived through the civil rights era, has adjudicated cases within this era, and is prolific in his understanding of the law. He is our first panelist. Thank you for joining us, Scott. Our next panelist, and I must admit, when I first was introduced to Lynda Williams, the mere fact that she stood 31 years in the Secret Service was fascinating to me. She is renowned for her temperament and her complete understanding of the law and the ability to separate law or the law from justice and or injustice. As a police officer in the Secret Service and beyond, she's phenomenal. In her retirement, she is now a professor at Middle Tennessee State University and is the president of NOBLE, which is the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. So without further ado, Lynda Williams, thank you for joining us and welcome to our program. Next, we have a dear friend who I've known for quite some time. She is currently the county state's attorney for the county of Prince George's County, Maryland, which happens to be the richest county or wealthiest county for African Americans in the country, thereby the richest county for African Americans in the world. She has the arduous task of looking at the various cases that come before her and with an unyielding eye, look at what cases are prosecutable and which cases she needs to give some other consideration to. It's a very daunting task that she has before us, but if anybody can do it, it is our friend, the Honorable Aisha Braveboy. And last but not least is a young man that, in my humble opinion, you know, they say that the young will lead us as we change the world. And this is a young man who, at a very tender age, has sat at the feet of the Right Reverend Al Sharpton, who has protested, who has watched injustice and has watched as the National Action Network has begun to right some of the wrongs that happen in this country. He is the policy advisor for the National Action Network. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Mr. Tylik McMillan. That is our panel for this evening. So let's get this party started. Young Mr. Wood, would you introduce the first question to our panelists?
Of course. This first question is for all our panelists. Please elaborate on tonight's panel and what the theme means to you. What exactly are justice and injustice? Oh, we will start with you, Mr. Bolden.
All righty. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me thank my panelists who are all freedom fighters, whether I know them or not. I know your backgrounds. And I want to thank the 100 Black men of Prince George's County and all the great work, mentorship, and leadership you all display. When I talk about social justice and injustice, it's a weird thing because social justice is about voting and about how we freedom, justice, and equality. And then injustice in the legal field and before the judiciary is probably more ordained than anything. When we see injustice, we go to court. But even the courts give us injustice depending on the case, depending on the police, depending on the defendants, if you will. I think we're at a pivotal moment in American life 400 years later. Congressman Clyburn talked about these moments. The Black Lives Matter movement is a moment. And so regardless of the Chauvin trial and the result, it's what we make this moment. And we got a real opportunity, at least up until 2022, to do some incredible things with the federal legislature while we have control, minimal control of all three houses, if you will, or two houses and the White House. And it's really up to us with that narrow margin. When we talk about voting rights, when we talk about the George Floyd bill, when we talk about infrastructure, when we talk about expanding family and healthcare and jobs in this economy, there's no better time for us to make strong progress with no help from the GOP to make strong progress on these areas that'll make our life for people of color, Black and brown folks, much better, more fair. And we can really, this American experience, this American experiment, we have that opportunity to attain freedom, justice, and equality. So I look forward to our discussion this evening.
Aisha, your thoughts?
When I think of social justice, the benefits, the opportunity to have and create wealth, the opportunity to have liberty, happiness, a good quality of life, to be treated fairly in society. So when I think of social justice, I think of all of those things. And when I think of the injustices, and especially when I think of the injustices that have occurred to my people, like slavery, like Jim Crow, like the, over-reliance on the criminal justice system to address mental health and addiction issues, like the difference in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, like the over-incarceration of Black men in particular, but Black people generally. When I think of the injustices around being able to, get contracts in your own county or in your own state, and how government oftentimes, creates greater disparities in terms of the ability for people to earn a living, to get government contracts, to get a quality education. To me, that's what injustice, those are some examples of injustices. And I think I look forward to talking a little bit more tonight about how we can, as a government, better address these issues so that we can create more fairness in our society.
Ms. Williams, you have a unique perch, I think, in that on the one hand, you are charged with serving and protecting the citizenry of the United States. So when you see justice or injustice as a person of color, as a Black woman, how do you juxtapose those two paradigms?
So first of all, thank you to the 100 Black men of Prince George's County and to my esteemed colleagues for this opportunity to use our unified voices to talk about an uncomfortable conversation as this. But it's important that we do, and as a Black woman, I was born Black, I'm gonna die Black, and I've been a woman and continue to be a woman. And so you have to know how to balance all of that. When we talk about these injustices, it's the unequal distribution of privileges and opportunities for us to thrive, to pursue that American dream, that we have to acknowledge that we are judged differently because of our gender, because of the color of our skin, but even more so that we're perplexed by a dual justice system that automatically discounts us for being of value in comparison to non-Black and brown citizens. And so you have to come with your best game. You got to know who you are and whose you are. You have to prepare yourself. You have to know the environment in which you're thriving, and then you show up as your best self.
I see that we're now also joined. Thank you very much, Ms. Williams. I see that we're also joined by Tylik McMillan. So the same question to you, Mr. McMillan. Justice or injustice? How do you see this system of laws and government as we exist today?
Yeah, so thank you all so much again for the invitation and inviting me. I do apologize. Today I was joining Attorney Benjamin Crump and the families impacted. We was at the Senate urging the senators to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and then we went over to the White House and had a conversation with top White House officials. So I do apologize for the delay. But when we talk about justice or injustice, I see it as injustice, but us as activists and as organizers fighting for that thing called justice. The thing we call justice, I don't think it has like a perfect term or definition, but we define that definition as we go on. We understand it was when slaves were brought to the shores of this country where the injustice started, in the systems of systemic racism and white supremacy. As we are unveiling those layers in the history of this country. And so I believe it is an unjust system, but we're all working together hand in hand to change policies, to change systems, to get to that more just society that we're all fighting for. And as Dr. King said in his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington.
So taking on that theme, Mr. McMillan, and all of the panelists, some would argue that the system is not unjust. It is working exactly as it was designed to work. So given that understanding, now 400 years later, since we were enslaved and brought to this country and treated as chattel property, what's changed? And how do we go about the process of changing it? Tylik, we'll start with you.
Yeah, of course. I think when we, as you said, this country was built on the backs of slavery, built on the backs of free labor, and built on the backs of us not being a citizen or even being considered, human. And so I think, as you said, that old the saying that this system is working the way it was designed to work. Yeah, that saying is true. But I do believe as we are going about change, I think about the Civil Rights Act, I think about the Voting Rights Act, and I think about this police bill that's currently in the Senate. Uh, Structural change happens when you make bold policy changes and bold action within organizations and within the government. And so I think that's how we get that change, by electing folks in office who agree with our values and our beliefs, who understand our experiences, and we legislate with authority. I think before, as we were fighting to have a seat at the lunch counter, now we know we deserve we deserve to own the lunch counter, and we deserve to own the restaurant. And so as time goes on, those ideas of what it should look like changes. But I think that happens through structural change and systemic change to get those things that we know that we deserve in this moment.
Scott, your thoughts?
Well, 400 years is a lot to capture in a Q&A, but let me say this. Sure, a lot has changed in regard to our voting rights, though they've been repealed, our civil rights, although we fight for those every day, our human rights, our right to be free from abuse by the police, but we see the killing fields, the police killing fields of America every day. And so the real challenge, in my opinion, for 2021 isn't what's changed, is how do we find sustaining change, if you will? How do we go to the higher level of the human condition and really practice and preach equality? Our biggest challenge is dressed up Jim Crow in the name of white privilege. I don't think people who look like me, or rather people who don't look like me, don't see me, right? That the police don't see me as a human being. That white privilege has taught them over the years that African Americans are less than or valued less than white Americans, that they're less intelligent, that they're less organized, that they're less proficient, that they are not as smart, if you will. And so we're always still surprised when Black people achieve the highest levels of success. That shouldn't be the exception. That should be the rule. But the white privilege issue, we continue to have to combat. It is at the root of our politics with the GOP or against the GOP. It is at the root of the fight with the police for police reform. But here's the biggest fight: that racism, systemic racism, continues to perpetuate itself even in 2021. None of us are born with a racism gene. So how is it that we're still fighting racism in 2021 as my forefathers fought 400 years ago, whether they were slaves or Jim Crow or through the civil rights movement? Someone's teaching our babies who don't look like me to be racist, either in their home or their environment. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. And yet and still, when you interview the Lindsey Grahams of the world or the Tim Scotts of the world, both senators right now, they would argue that America is not a racist system, that racism does not exist in America. It's hard to resolve that issue for people of color like me and you if we can't even agree on the core fundamental challenging problems in America when those who disagree and believe that racism doesn't exist, yet we have tons of socioeconomic and health disparities that show us that it does exist systemically and individually, and then the killing fields that we see with the police. And so that's what it means to me. That's what we've got to fight. And I hope we can talk about solutions to some of these issues before the night is over as part of this discussion.
Absolutely. Ms. Williams, as a member, a longstanding member of law enforcement and the president of Noble, where you within your ranks has to root out racism amongst police departments across the country. How do you do it? What's the answer? What's the solution to the good old boy network that, to use Scott's phrase, are taught racism is learned? If racism is learned behavior, and they have infiltrated the police department with the ability to weed out justice as they see fit, especially when the cameras aren't showing. How does blue combat racism with blue?
I echo and I agree with what has been said. You know, when I was a little girl, there was a book called The Encyclopedia. And I used to read those, and I saw this group called the Ku Klux Klan. And I said, Mom, why are the little mean white people so mean to the little brown people? I never thought that that bigotry, that hatred, that systemic racism would be still something that I have to face many decades later. So we have to call it out. You know, when you have a former Attorney General of the United States, you know, deny that such exists, you have to acknowledge, and I'm not saying that you have to agree with me, but you have to acknowledge you don't get to marginalize or invalidate my experiences because you have not. And even in the very history of policing, with the beginning of slave patrols, it already painted us as less than a citizen. And our judicial system just continued to perpetuate that. And so we are still thought of as less than. I don't care how much education, what status. So we have to call it out. We have to make laws. We have to have, you know, like push that George Floyd Policing Act, but have, you know, a national standards of use of force. But we have to have accountability and transparency, that there's consequences. You know, we're happy to see Derek Chauvin get convicted, but you know what? There are other culpabilities, and that you have to hit them where it hurts. And so we have to acknowledge that it exists. And you can agree to disagree, but you don't get to invalidate us. So you have to call it out in the ranks of police departments, across city officials. But if we talk about real change, we have to acknowledge the disparities, and that's across the board.
So Aisha, Braveboy, when these cases come across your desk as the county state's attorney, what's your thought process about things that you may know to be racist in their intent, or the charges are considered to be racist and or piled on? You know, there might be one infraction, but there are 15 charges. How do you adjudicate those realities when they come to your office?
Absolutely. Well, what we have decided is that we want to, you know, certainly try cases that are brought to us with integrity. So we certainly look at the credibility of the officer bringing the case. We also look at the actual evidence. Just because the officer brings charges to us, that does not mean that those are the charges that will ultimately go forward for a prosecution or other type of resolution. We look at the evidence. We look at the individual. Each defendant is unique, and the considerations for that defendant should be as unique as the defendant. So we look at, their criminal history. We look at the circumstances that may have led up to the incident. And sometimes we determine that even if we have enough evidence to move forward, we don't always move forward, depending on the type of charges that the individual is facing, because we have so many people in our communities that are suffering from addictions, that are suffering from mental health issues and other issues like trauma, homelessness, and other issues and other things that may impact their behavior. And so what we talk to our, especially our young attorneys about, is to see every single person as a human being. And that's what I think we have not done as a society successfully, is recognize everyone as a human being with frailties, right? With their own lived experiences and with their own vulnerabilities. And as we make decisions, we have to make decisions based on all that. We also have to make decisions in light of the fact that we know that there has been historic issues, let's say in Prince George's County, I'll say in particular, with our police department, with racism within our department, with unfair treatment with respect to our residents. And so in light of all of that, we have to, of course, keep our communities safe, which we are charged with. We have to hold individuals accountable for their bad actions, but we have to do that with a lens that recognizes that we have to look at the situation as a whole and not just a cookie cutter approach to criminal justice. So that's kind of how we look at our cases. And if we find and believe that a case has been overcharged, we will let the officer know, and we will move forward with the appropriate charges. In addition to that, if we believe that the officer acted unfairly towards the resident, if we believe that there are biased intentions, then we will dismiss those cases. And we have done so in the past, and we will continue to do that.
So as a follow-up for that, so what happens to the officer if your office is looking at the preponderance of charges that is filed against an individual, a resident, a defendant, and you realize that they're just piling on? Are there not consequences for the officer?
Well, the officer can charge, if they believe they have probable cause, that's the basis for their charges. Our job is to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence, a charge or a case beyond a reasonable doubt. That is our responsibility, and that's the checks and balances in the system that we use to ensure that people are not overcharged for offenses in our community. We recognize that in some cases, certain offices, I have 26 municipalities. The vast majority of them have police departments. I also have the Prince George's County Police. I have Park Police. I have state police that all operate in my county. And so when we have recognized that there are certain issues within certain departments, we will address those with those individual departments and with individual officers. We actually started a training, we call it the SAO Academy, where we train officers in what we are looking for, not necessarily what they're looking for, but what we are looking for and what will be acceptable and what will not be acceptable. Again, our job, we are protectors in the justice system, not only of the victims, but also of defendants, so that they receive fair treatment in our justice system, even if we are pursuing charges against them.
And just Michael, one follow-up. Yes.
I'm sorry, Michael. Aisha, this is a really important discussion because prosecutors have the power of discretion, but they have to be judicious in exercising that discretion. They have to be fearless in exercising that discretion. And if you're capable and you're elected and you're bright and you care about your community, and you're a progressive prosecutor, the way Aisha Braveboy is, in my opinion, right? Then that discretion and her power is really important to her community. That doesn't mean you lock up everybody that the police arrest. It doesn't mean that you use your discretion and not charge, if you will. It's a balance. But I will tell you this, you're more likely to get that fair discretion from an elected official who has lived my experience, who has lived in our Black community. And that doesn't mean that they are weak. That means they're strong with the way they exercise discretion. I don't believe we get that all the time with prosecutors around this country who either don't get it or haven't lived my experience or the Black experience.
Well, and speaking to that, Scott, Lynda, when you look at policing and you have the majority of police officers in America are white. So when you look at police that come from jurisdictions other than those that they are charged with policing, right? There's a cultural difference, and that lack of cultural difference then plays into their thought processes when it comes to serving and protecting the communities that they are held responsible for doing so. So how do we bridge that gap?
You know, in Noble, we say culture eats policy. You can have all the laws and regulations, you can have, you know, your standards, but until an individual understands the culture in that community, it makes a difference. You know, there's pros and cons that, you know, when an officer is from that community, he or she takes ownership and have an investment. But even as reality stands, that the majority of officers live outside of their community, but that's not an excuse. You have to learn, it has to be intentional, that you treat people and recognize just because they're different and their idiosyncrasies, don't make them less of a person. Don't make them, you know, just a suspect. But our culture is different. So you have to understand, so even if you're not from that community, so that comes from the hierarchy and leadership in an organization, that you have to train and you have to supervise. You don't let somebody come into a department and they don't have any other training until 30 years later, until something happens. But to be part of something, you have to be invested in it. And I've seen just as many non-Black and brown officers that are committed to doing what's right. And since 1976, Noble has stayed as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action. So boldly calling out those things internally and externally, because again, our unified voices are our strength. If we don't say anything, if you don't say anything about those officers standing next to you and you see them doing wrong, and if you see too many other things happening like that, we have to talk about it. And if we mean to clean house and accountability, that's what it takes. How do we expect to do community policing when a community does not even respect and understand the law enforcement, and law enforcement disrespects that culture? So in order to build that trust, to rebuild that trust, and to understand that we are guardians and not that occupying force of warriors, we have to show ourselves approved. And that means being in that community in non-adversarial conditions, not just when bad things happen, but to really and intentionally be part of that. And we have to hold ourselves accountable, and that's from the top down.
So when you look at the Chauvin case, where he kneeled on the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes, and you had 3 other officers that were standing around and saw nothing wrong, how does that happen?
Wow.
It's a cultural thing. They saw that it was wrong. They knew it was wrong. But you know what? When you make an example out of them, Chauvin is just one. You know, there was a case in Buffalo where they took a sister's pay and stripped her of all her title because she intervened to stop another officer from choking out another citizen. And so she just got reinstated all of her rights. When you start hitting them in their pockets, you know, everybody is not going to get to jail. But when you make an example that this is unacceptable, and it comes down to when you dehumanize a person that you think they're less than you, only a person that has no compassion could have done so. And so start with this. And it takes people like Chief Arredondo out of Minnesota and those other officers. You got to call it out for what it is. This is not a popularity contest. People are dying. You know, it's a frightful thing for people, especially young men of color, to go out because you don't know if you're going to come back home. You don't even know that as a Black and brown woman. So we have to call it out. You cannot hide behind that. And if it means stripping one by one and that accountability and that training to hold them accountable and make their severe consequences, then I think we can start seeing a change.
And remember, by the way, Michael, Chauvin trained 2 of those 3 other officers that are going on file. It would be hard for them to go against the guy that trained them. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, part of police reform many of us have been calling for is one, as Lynda said, you got to hit them in their pocket if they act out of line. There's got to be something compelling good police officers to report bad police conduct. In most jurisdictions, there aren't. And I got to tell you, in reporting that bad conduct, I don't want to hear about these bad apples and good apples. Because I'm going to tell you, if you are aware of bad conduct or a bad police officer and you don't report it, then you're complicit in it. And does that make you a good apple working with a bad apple and you say nothing? I don't want to hear it, because the killing fields of America are littered with Black men dying with police violence. Why is it that the police with Black folks go from zero to deadly force at a drop of a dime? Because to compel performance, to compel getting handcuffed, to compel getting in the car. Are you kidding me? You're going to use deadly force because I ignore a police order. That's barely a misdemeanor. But you got 5,000 insurrectionists at the Capitol climbing the walls that don't look like us, and not one, one gets shot, and they apologize for that. 5 officers got killed, and you still have a Republican Party that's in denial about the big lie, saying that these were patriots, if you will, and they're being prosecuted. Not one was arrested on sight. If those 5,000 were Black insurrectionists, they'd be laid out in front of the Capitol dead. They'd be a casualty of protecting democracy, and we'd be calling it a tragedy, if you will, and we have visuals. You don't have that right now. These folks are in jail, and most of them are getting out of jail. That's the systemic racism. When Tim Scott and others say there is no racism in America, then he needs to look at that comparative, because it's so powerfully obvious of how Black people are treated by the police versus white people, right? And I'm not talking about white officers. I'm talking about white and Black officers, right? You can be a bad police officer and be Black, white, yellow, or brown. And so these issues, we cannot resolve them until we can agree on the base of what the problem is. And if Tim Scott and Leslie Graham can't agree publicly that America is rooted in racism and it still exists. By the way, white people are the most unqualified people in America to talk about racism and what's racism, what is it. If you ain't lived it, how you gonna tell me about it? I can't hear you because you ain't lived my story, right? I've been beat up by the police. I've been slammed on the ground in front of my nice home. I've been stopped because of my nice car, right? And I have all the accoutrements of a successful attorney in Washington, D.C. I'm not bragging, I'm complaining. So I'm as afraid of the police as anybody else. And I shouldn't be. I'm an officer of the court. And yet we have this existence. Racism is here to stay, but we got to agree and lock arms and move forward and say, this is the problem and here are the solutions. The GOP just doesn't want to do that. They want to argue no. So you can't be bipartisan and you can't move forward. That's the real problem in this country, and solving it. We got to try to solve it without them, and then keep electing Democrats so we can keep the majority.
And so, if I can say something really fast on the tail end of that, I literally just left a meeting with Senator Tim Scott and Senator Graham both together, and as you just said, recognizing the history of this country and recognizing that Black bodies laying dead in the street is a non-negotiable. It's not negotiable. It's not negotiable to say the fact that we cannot breathe. It's not negotiable to say that a Black woman cannot sleep in her house. It's not negotiable to say that I cannot run out my house and run to the store in peace. It's non-negotiable that I can put my hands in the air with no weapon and I still get killed. These things of humanity, of basic humanity, as we said in the meeting today, we're not negotiating our lives. We can't negotiate those things. And so as we're talking about accountability,
it's a stupid negotiation.
Exactly. And so and that's, just trying to get that through their head. And even, Tim Scott himself being a Black man who he talks about the understanding of being stopped by police, being profiled even by Capitol Police, being a sitting United States senator, should understand the history of racism in this country and the history of white supremacy in this country. But first, in order for us to move forward, as you said, this country has to recognize the over 400 years of enslavement and free labor that Black people have made. And let's talk about reparations. Like, these conversations must be had in order for us to move forward.
You know, I agree with you, Tylik, because I think that if someone is debating you over whether or not racism exists in America, I would suggest that you just, don't waste your time, save your breath, because they know that that is not true. And you know that that's not true. So there is an understanding that there's racism in America, whether they want to admit it or not. So I would not even engage in that conversation. The conversation that we must engage in is reconciliation and how we move forward. Because what we don't want is a repeat of the last 400 years. That's what we don't want. And we can see, just based on what we have seen over the past couple of years, how quickly we can revert back in our thinking, in our economics, in our policing, and what we find acceptable. Just yesterday, actually, I had to indict a white police officer. Actually, I announced the indictment. We did the indictment on Tuesday. A white police officer who choked and assaulted a Black teenager. And the reason why I say he's a Black teenager is because we don't think of Black boys. We always think about Black men and that our Black boys are somehow superhuman, or they can take it, or they don't have the same frailties as white boys. This was a Black boy. And he was assaulted by an officer, we believe, okay? It's an indictment, not a conviction, but we believe. And it was two Black officers who came forward and provided information to internal affairs and to our office that we use to investigate and bring information to our grand jury, and they decided to indict. Now, I think that the reason why those officers felt comfortable coming forward is because they knew that they had a state's attorney's office who was unafraid to hold officers accountable. They also knew that they have leadership, and they have new leadership coming, but they have leadership in the department that has decided that they have to go in a different direction, and that their testimony, the evidence that they are providing, the reporting of that is a good thing. That is what is going to be expected of officers in Prince George's County. That has not always been our history, and I'm sad to say that because I grew up in the county, but we have been notorious for police abuse, for racism, and for corruption. And as state's attorney, my job is to say enough is enough. I will not accept it in my office. My expectation is that the police department will be transparent with me, and those who come to us to provide credible information and we pursue those charges, they should be protected. They should not be retaliated against. In fact, they should be celebrated because that is the type of professionalism that we must expect for our departments to have. And for those individuals who have the privilege of serving in our department, whether they're from the community or not, they have the privilege. When I say privilege, and you know this, Ms. Williams, because unlike most professions, police officers know that after 20 or 25 years, they can retire with full benefits and most of their salary. And then they can move on and they can go and get a second job, because oftentimes they're retiring in their 40s. Most people cannot retire in their 40s. So it is a privilege. It's an extreme duty. You have extreme duty. You work hard. I mean, it is not an easy job, but it is also a privilege to work in that industry and in that field and have that level of responsibility and authority in the community. And so my job, again, is to ensure that they are doing their jobs and using their privilege that they have in terms of being able to defend themselves, have weapons, have have the authority to detain people, to arrest people. They have to use common sense. They have to use decency. They have to use humanity, and they have to understand that my job is to hold them accountable for constitutional policing. So my expectations are high for our police officers, and when they don't meet that high level, then it is my job to hold them accountable. And, you know, we unfortunately have indicted about 14 or 15 officers since I've been state's attorney, and it hasn't really been that long. But, you know, my job is to send the message that I'm going to do my job. I'm going to be unafraid, and that I understand my role and my duty.
And let me just jump in on the tail end of everything that's been said. Facts do not cease to exist just because they are ignored. The images bear themselves out when we talk about the disparities. And as Scott has said, the insurrection, the domestic terrorist attack that occurred at the Capitol, in comparison to what we saw last summer for Black Lives Matter, they didn't have a problem. There were plenty of police officers on scene and standby for peaceful demonstrations. But again, that Capitol building is the people's capital, and there's a standing memorandum of security posture that stands ready to be activated at any time. They chose to ignore that because there was not Black and brown citizens that were doing that. There was these other people. And like Scott said, and I stated boldly, if those people had been Black and brown citizens, it would have been a bloodbath, and it would have been toe tags laying on every person out there on that campus. So the images bear themselves out. So they can say what they don't believe, but the images bear themselves out.
Yeah, but Lynda, let me ask you this, if I may. At some point,
Scott, let me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me.
No.
You're moderating, aren't you? Forgive me. Go right ahead.
You know, Scott. We're gonna have a chat after this is done.
I'm sorry. I was trying to be good. But my sisters, both on my left and right, I just love what they're saying. I love y'all, by the way. Go.
Well, and because I wanted to pivot back to that point as well, because Tylik, when I look at what happened on January 6th, and I juxtapose that to what happened the summer before, and the lack of accountability by the police, the Secret Service, the fact that they called over and over again for reinforcements in an administration that was reluctant to do so. Tell me what you guys had to do for the Black Lives Matter marches versus what we saw as these insurrectionists that overflowed the Capitol. And oh, by the way, you know, that police officer to me showed major restraint in not shooting those cats, because I'm sure had I been a police officer, if I had 16 shots, it would have been 16 shots. So, Tylik.
I'm glad you brought that up. So, as you all know, National Action Network and the leadership of Reverend Sharpton and Martin III helped convene the March on Washington this past 2020 March on Washington, and I happen to work in the Washington D.C. bureau and help organize that march. And just to understand the amount of meetings and the amount of applications and the amount of meeting with Park Police and meeting with these different agencies and the EMS and the firefighters, chief of fire department, understand the amount of meetings and work and papers and all these different things put into place to make that march happen. And the fact that all of those people showed up at the memorial where the president of the United States was speaking, and yet there was not one permit put in place, or insurance money put in place or put up, was really insane. And so for us, it was just, we went through all that work in August, yet to turn around and had, so much pushback, but yet in January, the president of the United States led an insurrection, and not one permit or insurance bond or insurance money was put up for this march, where thousands of people showed up to the march, to the mall, and showed up to the Capitol.
You know, Michael, if I could just supplement Tylik
Sure.
real
Go ahead,
quick,
Scott.
and that is technically under DC law, which is unique to the nation's capital, you don't need a permit to march. It says certain requirements, but there's a catch-all provision that says, but if you don't get these permits, if you don't do any of this, right, you can still gather under your First Amendment, but if you become a danger to health and safety, right, you must disband, and you can be subject to arrest, right? Now, if you notice, the insurrectionists went to the Capitol, would threaten the health and safety of everyone around them. Not one arrest was made that day. Not one. There were no buses there for protesters. There were no plastic handcuffs with the police. The protesters had plastic handcuffs, right? But it was a surreal scene because you only had so many police officers there. And under DC law, as you all may or may not know, the mayor, because we're not a state, has to call DOD or the president to get National Guard. And on this particular occasion, they had a memo that was written to reassert that. And so when the calls went to DOD, when they went to the White House, there was some unexplainable delay in releasing these soldiers, if you will, to go to the Capitol to support and defend and to make arrests. And none of them was still arrested that day, if you will. It's incredible. But I want to supplement what Tylik said because there's some nuance to the law there.
And can I also say what I have found from the prosecution, and when I look at what happened with many of those individuals who were eventually arrested, is that they were given special accommodations that none of us would ever be able to do. You know, when someone says that, you know what, I have certain special dietary restrictions, and so I need to be moved into a facility to meet my needs. It's one thing for a person to assert it. It's another thing for a judge to agree. Okay? In addition to that, you know, you had folks who, okay, well, I own my own business. I want to take my, staff out. We plan to go on vacay, and I need to have a special exception so I can leave my state so that I can enjoy some time away with my staff. It's one thing to ask for it. It's another thing to get it. So my point is, I feel like the prosecutors, as well as the court system, has not treated these insurrectionists with the level of seriousness that they would an African American or Hispanic individual for a much lesser offense. And so when we talk about humanity, it's not just how individuals view us. It's how systems treat us and what is allowed to occur within those systems that further, divides our nation and our country. I am embarrassed in many ways that these results are occurring, that number one, the prosecutors are not prosecuting for the most serious offenses, because isn't that what the prior administration, the Justice Department said? They said to charge the most serious offenses, right? Yet when we came to the insurrectionists who tried to destroy our country, what we're seeing is that they're being prosecuted for the least, in many cases, the least serious offenses. And so I have been disappointed when I've seen, the prosecution of this, how the court is treating these individuals. And so these are the issues that I hope are addressed by Congress, that I hope are addressed in our state capitals all across this country. And I hope that organizations like the NAACP and the National Action Network and all of these great civil rights organizations point out and demand equal and fair treatment, because it's embarrassing actually to see what happened in the aftermath of that.
If it wasn't so serious, it'd be funny, Michael.
Madam
It's
State,
unbelievable.
Madam State's Attorney, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, we're coming up on an hour, and we wanted to get into the Q&A with our audience, but I also wanted to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunity to have a conversation with our youth, in this case, young Mr. Javen Wood, because he's an 18-year-old looking at the world through his lenses. And we all know that the youth are the ones that are going to impose their will on the future of America. So, Javen, let me ask you, with all that you've heard, what are your impressions and what do you see, as Scott alluded to earlier, in terms of solutions, the path forward?
You're on mute.
Javen, unmute yourself.
Overall, my impression on the climate of policing and I guess racism in general is that it's a pretty bleak look. But I think thanks to the contribution of people like our panelists, the work they do, it's also a hopeful one. You know, especially regarding policing. As a Black young man, a tall, blonde young man, they might not be able to tell via the Zoom conference, but I'm a Goliath compared to most of my peers and people around me. And I think it's a really, I guess, a shame that police will probably be terrified of me because of that. You know, regardless of that, pretty sure if you ever got a chance to know me, they'll consider me a good guy, you know, someone, a human being. But most people like me don't get that chance, unfortunately. I guess in that sense, I'm afraid. But once again, that idea that courage isn't just ignoring fear; it's overcoming it. And I think there's a lot of great ways we can overcome it as well. One of the most important things to me is the vote. You know, it's like John Lewis said, it is secret. It is one of our most powerful entities in changing democracy. Like a ticket to solve a problem right in front of us. And even though it's been denied, it's still there. We're still citizens, and we can still vote. And once we get people that can represent us appropriately, compassionately, then we can think that we do it.
So, for those who are in the audience, if you have a question, we're not finished with you, Javen. Hold on. That have a question, please put it in the chat, and we will address it to our panel as soon as we begin to see them. So, Lynda, having heard the anxiety of an 18-year-old on his way to Howard University, not that much younger than Tylik, what are your impressions of his reality? You know, it's our shared reality, but we're older, so we're not looking at it through the eyes of someone who has their entire future ahead of them.
You know, it's an undaunting story that, you know, we as Black mothers and caretakers, that we have to tell our African-American sons, because they should be afraid. You know, my challenge is I talk to students, I challenge you to be safe and get home safely at nighttime. But we see, even when you do the right things, like in the incident with Lieutenant Nazario, that but he did the right thing. And, you know, it's not fair, but you have to try to take advantage of it. Like you say, remain calm. You know, thank God for cameras. They're still challenged, but at least that man had that to show, and to show how he responded. So I tell people, you don't win on the side of the road with the police officer. You don't win in court with them. So it's definitely not the time to call them out of their names. You have a right. When you get home, you can call them all kind of monkeys that you want to. But when you're there, Don't give them any additional thing. And I know it's unfair, but this is survival technique because they are looking for an excuse to dehumanize you, to become yet another statistic. Because think about it, just in the last year, how many non-Black and brown citizens have you seen play itself out in the same way that George Floyd or Dante Wright or Mr. Brown? I'll wait, because it does not happen. And like you said, we go from stop to bang, bang, dead. Mm-hmm. If you're scared to, and don't think people are going to easily comply with you, you're in the wrong profession, because law enforcement are not dealing with Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. Even if they're wrong, and they're scared and they're wrong and running, I don't condone that. But I say that you still have to treat people with, what a human factor, and recognize that they are a human being. And even when you have them in compliance, you have an obligation to render medical aid to a person. So Jalen and to Mr. Tylik, when you go out, you be the best that you can be. You know what? Try to always carry yourself, but record, have a witness, because it's always easier when you have something recorded versus your word versus ours. But being adversarial on the side of the road, it's not going to win you. But it's a scary time. And until we have some laws, and when we make accountability that, it's not bad apples, there's bad orchards. And we have to change the whole trajectory of how we have been doing policing, how we train police, how we follow up with them, and how we cover for them. We have to have the accountability to show no one is above the law.
Now, we do have a question from our audience, and that is, what's your impression and opinion about defunding the police, shifting the resources that are given to police departments for tanks and weapons of war against the citizenry of America, and redeploying those resources in social services and mental health professionals and the like? Lynda, let's start with you.
If you ask what the funding is, if I ask my students, they say do away with the police. But we know realistically, we cannot live in a lawless society. I say realign and look at it differently, because, it's the things that you do with the money. We need to realign ourselves with social services, with mental illness, homelessness, drug addiction, and of course, appropriate those things that we have a mitigation team. So even when law enforcement is responding, that you have that professional that are trained to deal with such. You can't take the police out of it, because there's always, most times, an element of danger. But you have to know that there's a collective effort. So we have to realign how we appropriate those funds to make sure that social services are supported, that they can work hand in hand with police, because there is an over-reliance of law enforcement, but it's not the answer. We have to look at it strategically, how we better work together to serve the communities, to be guardians and not just warriors.
I would like to agree with President Williams. One of my good friends who's a state delegate, his name is C.T. Wilson, he's a former prosecutor. He always says that, police are there to protect and serve, and they get the protect part down real good, but the service part, sometimes they get that wrong. But I also feel very strongly that we sometimes ask our police to provide services that they are not equipped to provide, because when they get a call for someone who is having a mental health crisis and they show up, if that person is aggressive, what they know is to meet aggression, being aggressive back, or to stop what they consider is a threat to them, or a threat that they perceive. Or maybe it is a real threat, but maybe that threat could be, calmed down or addressed differently. But those officers may not be equipped in de-escalation and in talking to someone who has a mental health issue. And also, we have to understand that police may be a trigger for an individual, especially a Black or brown individual who is going through a crisis. So even seeing someone in uniform could agitate them even further. And so being able to have responses, or people respond who are less threatening to our residents, to people who really need a different type of approach, is extremely important, because we do hear of incidents where people who have mental health issues or behavioral health issues end up getting, beaten and or, killed, unfortunately, by police. And it's because police have the ability and the right to use force that they believe is reasonable based on the circumstances. And that's the standard in Graham versus Connor. And that's why we have to get beyond Graham versus Connor, because it's a minimal standard, quite frankly. And so if I perceive a threat, if I perceive that you are a threat to me or to someone else, and that threat is at a level that is a lethal threat, then I have a right to use lethal force. And when you're dealing with mental health crisis, sometimes these individuals have weapons, whether they're knives or potentially guns or other types of weapons, that can be a threat. And if you are not able to de-escalate the situation because the language that you're using, the fact that you are and look like law enforcement is triggering to them, those situations end up really, really badly. And that really creates a further distrust between community and police, because oftentimes it's the family member that call the police to report that they have a loved one who's going through a crisis and they just need help. But sometimes when they respond, that help escalates into something tragic. And so being able to have more resources, I think, is extremely important so that police can do their jobs more effectively and the professionals can actually do a better job at responding when a professional is needed.
Thanks. Thank you, Aisha. Now, I do want to remind you that we have only 20 minutes left on the call, but I wanted to get Tylik's perspective from a policy perspective on defunding the police. And Tylik, if you can keep your answer brief, we can move on to get more questions in as possible throughout the remainder of our time.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep it brief. At National Action Network, we don't use the slogan "defund the police" as we're pushing for legislative change, but we understand that the communities is necessary. As we talk about the investment in education, the investment in mental health services, the investment in housing, the investment in jobs, we understand that these services are fundamental to creating a safe environment and a safe community. And so to that slogan, it's reinvestment in communities is needed. And as I said, laws need to be in place that hold officers accountable. And from there, the resources that are given to officers must be looked at, of course, but we must hold them accountable for their actions overall.
So the prospect of taking away the officer's Bill of Rights means what to the citizenry of America?
Oh, I saw the question, about qualified immunity. As stated today, I joined Attorney Benjamin Crump and families of Eric Garner, the families of Terrence Crutcher, the families of George Floyd, of Botham John. And so when we think about these families and just sitting in the room and hearing them, talk with senators and White House officials about this issue of qualified immunity, a lot of people who don't get their day in court. It goes in circles where they don't get the opportunity to really have a day in court. Qualified immunity is just a way that we see where officers feel, where they can get away with these instances of killing Black and brown bodies in our streets with no recourse. And so qualified immunity is a really big piece on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and really one of the main pieces as we're talking about structural change happening and holding officers accountable. And so qualified immunity is a really big piece, and I'm hoping that that can be passed in the Senate so officers are truly held accountable and not holding departments accountable, but we want to hold officers accountable, because just as a person who pulls a trigger in the street is held accountable for their actions, the officer who pulls a trigger on folks in the street should be held accountable as well.
Scott?
Well, it's got to be a key component to police reform because, listen, If the police officer says he or she made a furtive gesture, if they felt threatened or they felt they were under threat, that's a perception on their part. But they're trained. You're a trained police officer, and it's been abused by the police unions all around this country. These police bill of rights and this qualified immunity that basically says you've got to be so egregious in your conduct that therefore qualified immunity takes you out of that protection, as opposed to, well, you're not going to, if you shoot somebody and you make a mistake and you shoot somebody, you're a trained officer. You have a gun, a badge, and the American flag on your uniform. And you can shoot somebody, take their life, and be protected because you made a mistake. Oops. I thought he or she had a gun. Oops. I thought I was under threat. I thought he had a knife. All these thoughts.
I thought my gun was a taser.
Yeah, I thought my gun was a taser. And you walk. You can be back policing. You can go to another police force. You can stay and keep your job. And it's fundamentally wrong and subject to abuse by the police unions. And so you've got to do something to offset that. There are three things. One, you eliminate or limit qualified immunity to make it easy. It's not to make it easier to sue the police. It's that the police are now cognizant that they can be sued to compel better behavior. Two, if you get abusive incidents on your record, 2 or 3, you got to go do something. You got to go get trained. Your pension is subject. You get due process. Don't get me wrong, right? But you got to get something. You're going to lose something if you make mistakes out here, or if you're a racist cop, or you don't like black people, or you have this thing about us versus them, and you don't see me as a human being. You don't even see me as a dog, because you wouldn't shoot a dog, but you shoot black men all around this country. And so you got to have those 3 things, because until you compel better behavior, right? I don't want more police or less police or defund the police. I want better police. I want better police. I'm always call the police. I ain't got no choice, but I want them better. That's all. I want them to see me as a human being.
So Lynda, as the kids would say, if you're scared, say you're scared. So if you're scared, why are you on the police force?
And as the kids say, that part. Absolutely. You cannot be fearful of the very people that you're supposed to be protecting and serving. Everything that Scott said, absolutely. There's not a get out of jail free card. Just even the very premise of a qualified immunity was an ordinance. It was created even during the freedom fighters' time so that they couldn't even bring up charges against the very people that were, just treating them in such a way. And we have to hold that accountability. And, qualified immunity makes it easier for them to hide behind the unions. Any officer working in good faith, and there's liability insurance, if you're doing the right thing, you don't have to be fearful. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is looking. And so that's what we have to call it into and call it. So Noble fully support the George Floyd Policing Act. And we do have to revisit, because the way it's going now is going unchecked, and it's like a license out to kill, and there's no accountability for what your actions are.
Now, I recognize that we are running short on time, but we haven't really touched on voter suppression at all. And if you look at, there are over 34 states in the union that have introduced legislation that will actually suppress the vote. In Georgia in particular, they put in place legislation or are trying to put in place legislation that simply says if you're standing in line and you offer comfort and aid by giving some water, then you are no longer eligible to vote. Tylik, speak to these voter suppression laws that's taking place in Georgia and Oklahoma and Texas and all across the country as we see it right now.
Yeah, like I said, all across the country, we see these laws in place. And clear as day, it was said that they're trying to dilute the black vote because they understand the power of the black vote. It's crazy to me that all of this time, now all of a sudden in the state of Georgia, because it turned Democratic, that all of a sudden people need 2 forms of ID, or the fact that because of the long lines that is by the precincts from removing voting sites that is not caused by the voter, they're trying to stop folks from giving food or water. And so this is just a way to dilute the vote, and this is the 21st century of voter suppression, and so we honestly have to fight back and really elect these voting officers. As we're talking about redistricting, we're talking about state voter laws. It just really echoes the importance of that, and it echoes the importance of S1 being passed, the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act. So we have a federalized law on the books, so individual states can't start doing their own thing. So this is exactly why we need that John Lewis Voting Advancement Act to be passed in the Senate.
And to be clear, this is an outgrowth of the fact that Black folks in particular came out to vote in the 2020 elections, not because they stayed home.
Exactly.
Scott, I know you had something to say.
I'll try to be brief this time. There are 347 voter suppression bills in all 5 or 6 of those states. Okay, and many of them are in Republican legislatures. Many of them have passed or are going to pass. Our next order of business is organizing and going to the federal courts and having them struck down as unconstitutional, if that's possible. Tylik, forgive me, brother. Tylik is really right about one thing. We don't have a Voters' Right Act that would have to support or approve these state laws. Normally, that was struck down by the Supreme Court several years ago, and because there's so many Republicans in the House and Senate, the Voting Rights Act bill and what the Democrats have approved in the House certainly needs to be passed if they can beat the filibuster. Without the filibuster, we're left with the federal courts, and we're also left with Black people and brown people in the South just having to get smarter and work harder if these laws stand. And what do I mean by that? Okay, if they're only going to give us 1 Sunday, 2 Sundays before elections, we got to load up. If they're going to make us do voter ID, fine. If they're going to make us bring water with us, fine. But we got to fight and get smarter than they are, because with the will of the people, no one can suppress this vote. We just got to keep fighting. And that's asking a lot. I mean, we turned Georgia. I mean, we turned some other states. We beat Trump. He got 74 million votes. I got to tell you, the Republicans' policies are not going to allow them to win with their voters. And so voter suppression is the only alternative. That's the only reason they do it, because they can't win an election. At least most federal elections, they wouldn't be able to do it. And so we got to fight, man. And we got to go to court, and we got to try to get the Voting Rights Act passed. That's bottom line proposition, and it never stops being that.
Tylik, give us the Cliff Notes version of what the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill means and what's in it.
Yeah, so as Mr. Scott mentioned, it really federalizes our elections, and so as we're talking about, say for example, we're talking about redistricting, or we're talking about like a lot of these major things. As we look at this, state of North Carolina, gerrymandering, and all of these really big pieces that really disenfranchises, and dilutes the Black and brown vote. It really addresses that. But we're talking about, as we're talking about lowering the age to vote, like it encompasses an overall to really make voting easier. And so as we think about different ways to make the voting easier, this bill really is a total encompassing bill of that, but it really is really big, whereas I'm talking about redistricting.
Yeah, but it allows DOJ to come in and have to approve all of these changes too, doesn't it, Tylik?
It does.
That's a huge piece that they have to be approved by DOJ if they do these local state laws, and we don't have that capacity. We just got to go to federal court now. I think I'm right about that. You tell me, Tylik.
Yeah, I believe so, but I'll have to double check on that. But I do remember it giving that to the DOJ, from what I remember.
Now, Aisha, you are a former delegate in the state of Maryland. Tell me, are these anti-protest bills actually anti-Black Lives Matter bills?
You know, that's a good question. I think that, you know, we have constitutional rights, and everyone has those rights. And we have a right to peaceably and peacefully assemble. And, you know, it's interesting what freedoms and liberties state legislatures want to protect, and those that they will disregard when it benefits them. And it is really disappointing when you look at some of our basic constitutional rights be questioned based really on who is exercising those rights. And so I think we have to resist those types of laws that threaten our constitutional rights, especially when they are being exercised by people who have to speak truth to power, that they know that their right to assemble, the fact that they are assembling, is pushing America in a new direction. We know that it is because of the organization of young people, of Black people, of brown people, of young white people too. We know that it is that exercise of their right to assemble that has led to this massive change in the direction when we look at, you know, criminal justice reform. It's what led Maryland to be the very first state to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And so I think this is really an attack on our constitutional rights, and we should call it out as such. And so that's what I think. And I just want to say one more thing on the voting rights piece. You know, Texas is getting 2 new congressional seats because 4 million new Texans moved in over the last decade. A lot of them look like me and you and our brown sisters and brothers as well. And that is why a state like Texas is scared out of their mind, or those who are in charge of creating the laws and creating the districts, because what they recognize is that the state is moving in another direction it's growing, it's becoming more diverse, and there's really nothing they can do about the people who are moving in. So what they're trying to do is suppress the rights of those individuals when they get there. And that is ridiculous, because they're going to use their tax dollars to fund every construction project, to enrich themselves through government contracting and everything else. But then they don't want those same people to have their voices and their will heard at the ballot box.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because of the census, there is a demographic shift of the population to more southern states, which lends itself to other congressional seats and senatorial seats in those states, Florida and Georgia and Mississippi and Texas and Alabama and the like. So given those demographic shifts, is it enough to turn red states blue?
And we still got to be strategic about it. Just like they said, they give us the rules of engagement. We accomplished that. We went from guessing how many jelly beans into a jar as being mathematicians. So even when we do what they ask us and do it accordingly, they keep moving the goalposts. And that's what these voting rights are. You know what? Because we did the right thing. We got out. We galvanized. We made a difference. Now they want to change it again. So we have to stay on the pulse. We have to keep on doing, like Scott said, we have to be creative. Okay, you move this route. We still have to get up ahead of time to make sure that even still, when they change these rules of engagement, that we are strategic enough to know how to play the game. Because that's the thing about it. They're going to always keep Black and brown citizens suppressed if they keep changing the rules and they're sitting in the majority.
Yeah,
But
Michael.
does it cause a sense of fatigue on the part of the citizenry to keep up with all of these ever-changing legislations that are meant to take away our voting rights and our ability to elect those in which we feel are the best suited to fight our causes?
Hell yeah. Fatigue. Damn right it does.
What you said.
Send more troops to the front line for voting rights. We got plenty of Black and brown people. Send them
What
up.
you said.
Damn right they do. Now, here's the thing about the census. Right now, we have the preliminary information. The northeastern states lost seats. The South and the West gained seats. Okay, that's okay. We don't really know all the data yet. The data we need to be talking about is who's in these population shifts, as Aisha said. Because if Black and brown people are moving to Texas, Georgia, and some of the states that gain seats, that's a good thing. If white conservatives move south and to the west, vis-a-vis Utah and elsewhere, that's not a good thing. But if they're in red states already and they gained a seat, that's not good because they gained a seat. But if they're a red state already, I'm not as concerned about that as if they're moving and these population shifts turn a blue state to red or keep a purple state purple or keep it red. You follow what I'm saying? We need to break down those population shifts and then we'll know. Look for analysis on the real impact as we move into 2022. Look for analysis on those population shifts and the race and sex and economic dynamics of those that move, that cause those census shifts. That's really what you want to look at.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do appreciate so much you participating in the 100 Black Men of Prince George's County's Town Hall. We've reached the end of our time, but I wanted to thank you collectively as well as individually. Scott Bolden, Lynda Williams.
Your Honor, thank you for having me.
Tylik
letting me
McMillan.
talk.
We'll talk about that later. And Her Honor, Aisha Braveboy, thank you so very much. I also wanted to thank our engineer, the Right Reverend Dr. Marquise Ball, for pulling all of this together. He oftentimes does not get the adulation that he so richly deserves. And to my co-host, young Mr. Wood, sir, thank you. You are our future. We appreciate you, and we look forward to your continued gifts as you bring forth the next generation of freedom fighters in America. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And with that, I bid you a fond adieu. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.